The rain drummed against the windows of Tony's motorcycle repair shop as he wiped his hands on an old rag. It had been a long Tuesday, filled with oil changes and brake repairs that barely paid the bills. The clock on the wall showed 7:30, and he was ready to call it a day. Tony had been running this small shop in East Cleveland for 12 years now, building his reputation one satisfied customer at a time. He was just reaching for the light switch when he heard the unmistakable rumble of a motorcycle engine outside. The sound was different, though, deeper, more raw than the modern bikes he usually worked on. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a figure pushing a classic Harley-Davidson toward his shop door. The bell above the door chimed as an elderly, white man entered, water dripping from his leather jacket. He had to be in his 70s with silver hair slicked back and hands that told stories of decades working with machinery. His jacket was worn but well-maintained, and Tony noticed the careful way he handled the motorcycle, like it was precious, cargo. "You still open?" the stranger asked, his voice gravelly but polite. Tony nodded, curious despite his tiredness. "What can I do for you?" "Name's Dutch," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "Got this old girl here that needs some attention before I can let her go." As Dutch wheeled the motorcycle further into the shop, Tony felt his breath catch. It was a 1973 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, and even in the dim light, he could see it was something special. The chrome had that particular patina that only came from years of careful riding, and the paint job was original, a deep blue that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. "Beautiful bike," Tony said, running his eyes over the machine. "What seems to be the trouble?" Dutch shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the shop as if making sure they were alone. "Well, she's been sitting for a while. Engine's running rough, and I want to make sure everything's right before—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Before I find her a new home." Tony understood immediately. This wasn't just about mechanical problems. This was about saying goodbye to something that meant everything to its owner. He'd seen it before with older riders who had to give up their bikes for health reasons or family pressure. It was never easy. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Tony asked. Dutch nodded, stepping back but keeping his eyes on the bike. Tony began his examination, running his hands along the engine, checking connections, and listening to the subtle sounds that told him what needed attention. As he worked, he noticed details that made him pause. The wear patterns weren't typical. The modifications were professional but unusual. And there, tucked under the seat where most people would never look, was a small patch sewn into the leather. Tony had been around motorcycles and their culture long enough to recognize what he was seeing. The patch was small, discreet, but unmistakable. A Hell's Angels insignia. He glanced up at Dutch, who was watching him carefully, clearly aware that Tony had noticed something. Neither man said anything about the patch. Tony simply continued his examination, treating Dutch with the same respect he showed every customer who walked through his door. In his shop, what mattered was whether someone was honest and treated him fairly in return. Everything else was background noise. "She's got good bones," Tony said, finally straightening up. "Needs some work, though. Carburetor could use a rebuild, and there are some gaskets that should be replaced. Nothing major, but it'll take a few days to do it right." Dutch nodded slowly. "You think you can help her run like she used to?" "I can make her purr," Tony said, with confidence. "Question is, are you looking for a quick fix or do you want it done properly?" For the first time since entering the shop, Dutch smiled. "I've never been one for shortcuts." Tony quoted a fair price, explaining exactly what work needed to be done and why. He could see Dutch relaxing as they talked, the initial tension fading, as both men recognized they were dealing with someone who understood motorcycles and respected their history. "When can you start?" Dutch asked. "Tomorrow morning," Tony replied. "I'll need a few days to get the parts, but I can have her ready by Friday." Dutch pulled out an old leather wallet and counted out bills for a deposit. "Take your time," he said. "I'd rather have it done right than done fast." As they completed the paperwork, Tony noticed Dutch glancing around the shop, taking in the tools, the workbench, and the photos of motorcycles Tony had restored over the years. It felt like an evaluation, though not an unfriendly one. "You do. Good work," Dutch said, studying a before and after photo of a vintage Indian motorcycle Tony had rebuilt. "I try to treat every bike like it's my own," Tony replied honestly. Dutch nodded approvingly. "That's the right way to think about it." He paused at the door, looking back at his shovel head. "She's been with me a long time, 38 years to be exact, seen a lot of miles together." Tony could hear the emotion in the older man's voice. "Must be hard to let her go." "Time comes when you have to face reality," Dutch said quietly. "Health ain't what it used to be, and she deserves someone who can give her the attention she needs." After Dutch left, Tony stood alone in his shop looking at the shovelhead. He'd worked on thousands of motorcycles over the years, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the quality of the machine or its obvious history, it was the trust Dutch had placed in him. The old man could have taken his bike anywhere, but he'd chosen Tony's small shop. Tony ran his hand along the fuel tank, feeling the slight imperfections that spoke of real use, real adventures. Whatever Dutch's story was, this motorcycle had been a central part of it. And now Tony was being trusted to help write its final chapter. He made a mental note to order the best parts available, not the cheap alternatives. This wasn't about maximizing profit. It was about honoring the relationship between a man and his machine. As he finally turned off the lights and locked up for the night, Tony found himself looking forward to the work ahead. Something told him this wasn't going to be just another repair job. Dutch had chosen his shop for a reason, and Tony was determined to prove that trust hadn't been misplaced. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the shop, the shovelhead waited patiently for its restoration to begin. The next morning would bring new challenges and discoveries. But tonight, Tony went home with the satisfaction of knowing he'd been chosen for something important. In a world where trust was hard to come by, Dutch had offered his to a stranger based on nothing more than a conversation and a handshake. Tony wouldn't let him down. Tony arrived at his shop early Wednesday morning, eager to begin work on Dutch's shovelhead. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving the streets clean and the air fresh. He unlocked the door and flipped on the lights, his eyes immediately drawn to the classic Harley sitting in the center of his workspace. He started by draining the old oil and examining what came out. The fluid was darker than it should be, but not terrible, just evidence of a bike that had been sitting unused for too long. Tony made notes on his clipboard, documenting everything he found. This wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about understanding the motorcycle's history through the wear patterns and maintenance choices made over the decades. Around 10 in the morning, the bell above his door chimed. Dutch walked in, moving with the careful steps of someone whose joints reminded him daily of his age. He carried 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "Thought you might need some fuel," Dutch said, offering one of the cups to Tony. Tony accepted the coffee gratefully. "You didn't have to do that, but I appreciate it." Dutch pulled up an old chair that Tony kept for customers who wanted to watch him work. "Mind if I stick around for a bit? Don't get to see quality work being done very often anymore." "Not at all," Tony replied, genuinely pleased to have the company. "Might learn something about this old girl from you." As Tony worked, removing the carburetor for cleaning, Dutch began sharing stories, not the dramatic tales you might expect, but the quiet moments that really mattered. Long rides through the countryside on Sunday mornings, the satisfaction of keeping the bike running perfectly, the brotherhood found in helping fellow riders when they broke down on the highway. "She's been through a lot," Dutch said, watching Tony carefully disassemble the carburetor. "Rode her to California and back in '89. Took her on camping trips with my friends. Even rode her to my daughter's wedding, though my wife wasn't too happy about that." Tony looked up from his work. "Your wife didn't like motorcycles?" Dutch chuckled. "She tolerated them because she loved me. Always worried, though. Can't say I blamed her." His expression grew more serious. "Lost her 2 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry," Tony said quietly, understanding now why Dutch might be selling the bike. Sometimes letting go of one thing helped you hold on to the memories of another. "She used To say the bike was my first wife, Dutch continued. I'd tell her that wasn't true. The bike never argued with me about taking out the garbage. Both men laughed, and Tony could see some of the tension leave Dutch's shoulders. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, with Dutch occasionally pointing out modifications he'd made over the years or explaining why certain parts had been replaced. You rebuild this engine yourself? Tony asked, noticing the professional quality of some internal work. Had help from a friend who knew engines better than I did, Dutch admitted. But yeah, we tore her down to the frame back in '95. Wanted to make sure she'd run another 30 years. Tony was impressed by the quality of the work. Whoever had helped Dutch knew what they were doing. Every bolt was properly torqued, every gasket perfectly seated. This wasn't shade tree maintenance, this was craftsmanship. As the day wore on, their conversation drifted to other topics. Dutch asked about Tony's background, how he'd learned to work on motorcycles, what it was like running his own business. Tony found himself opening up more than usual, perhaps because Dutch listened without judgment and asked thoughtful questions. Started working on bikes when I was 15, Tony explained while cleaning carburetor jets. My uncle had an old Honda that wouldn't run. Spent a whole summer figuring out how to fix it. Been hooked ever since. Good way to learn, Dutch nodded. Nothing teaches you like a bike that won't start. Thursday brought more of the same comfortable routine. Dutch arrived mid-morning with coffee and settled into his chair to watch Tony work. Today's task was replacing worn gaskets and seals, detail work that required patience and precision. You know, Dutch said during a quiet moment. I've been riding for over 40 years and I've seen a lot of mechanics. Most of them are in too much of a hurry. They fix the problem, but they don't understand the bike. Tony paused in his work. What do you mean? They treat it like it's just a machine. Replace this part, tighten that bolt, collect the money. But a bike like this, she's got character, she's got preferences. You can't just fix her. You have to understand her. Tony nodded, knowing exactly what Dutch meant. Every bike's different, even if they came off the same assembly line. Exactly, and you get that. I can tell by the way you handle her parts, the way you take your time to do things right instead of just doing them fast. On Friday morning, Tony had the shovel head running beautifully, the engine purged, smooth and strong, the carburetor feeding fuel perfectly, and every system working in harmony. He'd gone beyond the basic repairs, adjusting timing and cleaning connections that weren't strictly necessary, but would make the bike run better. Dutch arrived earlier than usual, his anticipation obvious. When Tony fired up the engine, the old man's face lit up with a smile that took years off his appearance. Listen to that, Dutch said over the rumble. Sounds like she did 20 years ago. Tony let the engine warm up, then took the bike for a short test ride around the block. When he returned, he was grinning. She runs like a dream. Smooth power, no hesitation, perfect throttle response. Dutch climbed onto the bike, his movements becoming more fluid as muscle memory took over. He rode around the parking lot slowly, reacquainting himself with the machine he'd known so well. When he stopped and turned off the engine, Tony could see moisture in the old man's eyes. You did more than fix her, Dutch said quietly. You brought her back to life. As they completed the paperwork and Dutch paid the bill, both men seemed reluctant to end their time together. Over 3 days, they'd built an unexpected friendship based on mutual respect and shared passion for motorcycles. I hate to see her go, Dutch admitted, running his hand along the fuel tank one last time. Any idea who might be interested in buying her? Tony asked. Dutch shook his head. That's the hard part. I want to find someone who will appreciate what she is, not just someone looking for a weekend toy. Tony thought for a moment. You know, I might be able to help with that. I know a lot of people in the motorcycle community, collectors, enthusiasts, people who understand bikes like this. Dutch looked surprised. You'd do that? She deserves the right owner, Tony said simply. And after spending this week working on her, I feel invested in making sure she ends up in good hands. For the first time since Tony had met him, Dutch seemed genuinely moved. I'd appreciate that more than you know. As Dutch prepared to leave, riding the shovelhead one more time before putting her up for sale, he turned back to Tony. You're good people, he said. Your uncle taught you well. Tony watched Dutch ride away, the Harley's engine note fading into the distance. He had no idea that his offer to help find a buyer would lead to consequences neither of them could have imagined. Tony spent that weekend thinking about Dutch in the shovelhead. He couldn't shake the image of the old man's face when he'd ridden the bike for what might be the last time. There was something deeply personal about watching someone say goodbye to a machine that had been part of their life for nearly 4 decades. Monday morning brought the usual routine of oil changes and tune-ups. But Tony found his mind wandering to Dutch's situation. During his lunch break, he pulled out his phone and started making calls to people he knew in the motorcycle community. His first call was to Jake, who ran a vintage bike show every summer. "Hey Jake, it's Tony from the shop. I've got a friend with a '73 shovelhead he's looking to sell. Original owner, completely restored, runs perfect. You know anyone who might be interested?" Jake was immediately curious. Shovelhead? Those are getting harder to find in good condition. What's he asking? Tony realized he hadn't even discussed price with Dutch. "I'll have to get back to you on that. Just wanted to put some feelers out first." His next call was to Linda, who collected classic Harleys and had a reputation for treating them with respect. She was definitely interested, but was leaving for vacation in 2 weeks. Tony made a note to follow up with her later. By the end of the day, he'd contacted 8 people and already had 3 serious inquiries. The motorcycle community might be large, but when it came to quality vintage bikes, word traveled fast. Tuesday afternoon, Dutch stopped by the shop. He wasn't riding the shovelhead today. Instead, he arrived in an old pickup truck that had seen better days. "How's she running?" Tony asked, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Like a new bike," Dutch replied with genuine appreciation. "Haven't heard her sound that good in years. You really know what you're doing." Tony poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he kept going all day. "I made some calls yesterday, already got a few people interested in the bike." Dutch raised his eyebrows. "That was fast." "Good bikes don't stay on the market long," Tony explained. "Especially ones with the kind of history yours has. I didn't give out any details yet. Figured I should talk to you first about what you're looking for in a buyer." They sat down in the small office area of the shop, and Tony could see Dutch was wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to sell the bike quickly and move on, but another part was clearly struggling with letting go. "I keep thinking about who she'll end up with," Dutch admitted. "Sounds stupid maybe, but I want to know she'll be appreciated." "Not stupid at all," Tony assured him. "A bike like that deserves the right owner. Tell me what matters to you." Dutch was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I don't want someone who's just going to trailer her to shows and polish her every weekend. She was built to ride, but I also don't want some kid who'll beat on her or modify her into something she's not." Tony nodded, understanding perfectly. "What about price range?" "Fair market value. I'm not trying to get rich, but I need enough to help with some medical bills and maybe fix up the truck." Dutch gestured toward his pickup outside. "Getting old ain't cheap." Over the next hour, they talked through what Dutch was looking for. Tony took notes, asking questions about the bike's documentation, service history, and any original parts. That came with it. Dutch had kept meticulous records, every receipt, every modification, every mile logged in a small notebook he'd carried in his jacket pocket for decades. "You've got everything a collector would want," Tony said, impressed by the organization. "This kind of documentation makes the bike worth significantly more." That evening, Tony stayed late at the shop, not working on motorcycles, but on something entirely different. He set up his camera equipment, the same gear he used to photograph bikes for insurance claims, and carefully composed shots of Dutch's documentation. Then he sat down at his computer and began writing. The listing he created wasn't like the typical classified ads you'd see online. Instead of just listing specifications and price, Tony told the story. He wrote about the bike's history, the care it had received, and the kind of owner who would appreciate it. He didn't mention Dutch by name or include any personal details, but he painted a picture of a motorcycle that had been loved and maintained by someone who understood what it meant to be a steward of something special. He included high-quality photos he'd taken of the bike after completing the restoration, showing every detail from multiple angles. The pictures captured not just the mechanical perfection, but the character that came from years of careful ownership. Wednesday morning, Dutch returned to find Tony had printed out the listing draft for his approval. "What's all this?" Dutch asked, settling into his usual chair with coffee. "Thought you might want to see how I plan to present the bike," Tony said, handing over the papers. Dutch read slowly, his expression changing as he took in Tony's words. When he finished, he looked up with surprise. "You wrote all this?" "Figured. She deserved better than motorcycle for sale runs good. This makes her sound like something special." "She is something special," Tony replied simply. Dutch read through the listing again, more carefully this time. "You really think someone will pay attention to all this detail?" "The right buyer will. The wrong buyer won't bother reading past the first paragraph, which saves everyone time." That afternoon, Tony posted the listing on several motorcycle forums and collector sites. He also sent personalized messages to the contacts who'd expressed interest, attaching the full listing and photos. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By evening, Tony's phone was ringing constantly with inquiries. Some callers clearly hadn't read the full listing and were just looking for a cheap vintage bike. Others asked thoughtful questions that showed they understood what they were looking at. One call stood out from the rest. The caller introduced himself as Robert, a collector from 2 states away who specialized in shovelheads from the early 70s. He'd read every word of the listing and asked specific questions about the bike's provenance and condition. "I've been looking for exactly this bike for 3 years," Robert explained. "Not just any shovelhead, but one with this kind of history and documentation. Would it be possible to arrange a viewing?" Tony liked the way Robert spoke about the motorcycle, with respect and genuine appreciation for its significance. After talking for nearly an hour, he felt confident this might be the right buyer. Thursday morning brought more calls, but Tony's attention was focused on preparing for Robert's visit, scheduled for Saturday. He wanted everything to be perfect. Not just the bike, but the entire experience. This wasn't just a sale. It was a transfer of responsibility from one caretaker to another. Dutch arrived early Thursday, nervous energy evident in his movements. "You really think this Robert fellow is serious? He's driving 400 miles to look at a motorcycle," Tony pointed out. "That's pretty serious commitment. What if he doesn't like her in person?" Tony smiled. "Then we keep looking. But Dutch, I've got a good feeling about this one. He asked all the right questions, knew exactly what to look for in the documentation, and he's already arranged financing. This isn't someone looking for a bargain. He's looking for the right bike." As they sat in the shop, drinking coffee and watching the shovelhead gleam under the fluorescent lights, both men knew they were approaching a turning point. Tony had gone far beyond what any mechanic would normally do, investing his time and expertise in helping a customer he'd known for less than a week. But something about Dutch and his story had touched him, creating a bond that transcended the usual business relationship. Saturday would bring answers, but for now, they could only wait and hope that Tony's instincts about Robert were correct. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear, perfect weather for looking at motorcycles. Tony had arrived at his shop early to make sure everything was ready for Robert's visit. The shovelhead sat polished and gleaming in the center of the workspace, every chrome piece reflecting the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Dutch arrived at 9 sharp, carrying his usual coffee but moving with obvious nervous energy. He'd dressed up for the occasion, clean jeans, a pressed shirt, and boots that had been recently polished. Tony could tell this meeting meant everything to him. "You look ready," Tony observed with a smile. "Want to make a good impression?" Dutch replied, adjusting his shirt collar. "This feels more important than selling a bike somehow." Robert arrived exactly on time, driving a clean pickup truck with a motorcycle trailer attached. He was younger than Tony had expected, maybe in his 40s, with the careful movements of someone who knew his way around motorcycles. As he climbed out of the truck, Tony noticed he took a moment to look around the neighborhood, taking in the shop and its surroundings. "You must be Tony," Robert said, extending his hand. "And this must be Dutch." The introductions were warm but formal, with all three men understanding the significance of the moment. Robert's eyes immediately went to the shovel head, and Tony watched his expression change to one of genuine appreciation. "She's exactly what you described," Robert said softly, approaching the bike with obvious respect. "May I?" Dutch nodded, and Robert began his inspection. Unlike tire kickers who just looked at the shiny parts, Robert examined everything methodically: the frame, the engine cases, the electrical connections, even the wear patterns on the foot pegs. He asked thoughtful questions about maintenance, history, and listened carefully to Dutch's answers. "The restoration work is exceptional," Robert said after examining the engine. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Dutch smiled. "Had some help from people who understood these old machines." After an hour of careful inspection, Robert straightened up. "Would it be all right if I took her for a short ride?" "Of course," Dutch replied, though Tony could see the emotion in his eyes as he handed over the keys. Robert fired up the shovel head, letting it warm up properly before easing out of the parking lot. He was gone for 20 minutes, and when he returned, his face showed the satisfaction of someone who'd just experienced something special. "How'd she feel?" Dutch asked anxiously. "Like writing a piece of history," Robert replied honestly. "The power delivery is smooth, the handling is exactly what you'd expect from a properly set up shovel head, and the sound—" He paused, searching for words. "That's the sound I remember from when I was young and these bikes were everywhere." The negotiation that followed was refreshingly straightforward. Robert offered Dutch's asking price without haggling, and Dutch accepted without hesitation. Both men seemed to understand they'd found what they were looking for. As they completed the paperwork, Robert shared his plans for the bike. He collected shovel heads from the early 70s and had a climate-controlled garage where he kept them. He rode each one regularly, believing that motorcycles were meant to be used, not just displayed. "She'll be in good company," Robert assured Dutch, "and I promise she'll see plenty of roads." By noon, the shovel head was loaded on Robert's trailer, secured with the care usually reserved for precious cargo. As Robert prepared to leave, he handed Dutch an envelope containing the full payment in cash, exactly as agreed. "Thank you both," Robert said, shaking hands with Dutch and Tony. "This has been one of the best motorcycle transactions I've ever been part of. You gentlemen are exactly the kind of people this community needs." After Robert drove away, Dutch and Tony stood in the empty shop, both feeling the absence of the shovel head that had brought them together. Dutch stared at the spot where the bike had been, his expression unreadable. "You did good," Tony said quietly. "She's going to someone who'll take care of her." Dutch nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's just, after 38 years, that's a big part of my life, driving away." They shared a quiet cup of coffee, talking about anything except motorcycles. Dutch mentioned he might stop by the shop occasionally just to see how Tony was doing. Tony said he'd like that. When Dutch finally left, driving his old pickup truck, both men knew something had ended, but also that something new had begun. Sunday passed quietly. Tony spent the day catching up on paperwork and preparing for the coming week. He found himself thinking about Dutch, wondering how the old man was adjusting to life without his beloved shovelhead. Monday morning started like any other. Tony unlocked his shop, turned on the lights, and started the coffee pot. He had 3 motorcycles scheduled for service that day, and he was looking forward to getting back to his normal routine. At 7:30, as he was reviewing his appointment book, Tony heard the distinctive sound of motorcycle engines outside. Not just one or two, but many. The rumble grew louder and more complex, like a mechanical thunder that seemed to fill the entire neighborhood. Tony walked to his front window and felt his heart skip a beat. The street in front of his shop was filled with motorcycles. Not just any motorcycles, but dozens of Harley-Davidsons, lined up in neat rows that stretched as far as he could see. And standing beside those motorcycles were their riders, men and women in leather vests and jackets, all facing his shop. His first instinct was to check that his doors were locked, but as he looked closer, he realized the crowd wasn't threatening. They were simply waiting, organized and quiet, like they were there for a specific purpose. Then Tony saw Dutch. The old man stood at the front of the group, but he looked different somehow. Gone was the solitary, slightly uncertain figure Tony had come to know. In his place stood someone who clearly commanded respect among these intimidating-looking people. Tony's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. The leather, vests, and patches told a story he was only beginning to comprehend. These weren't just motorcycle enthusiasts out for a Sunday ride. The organized way they'd arranged themselves, the respect they showed Dutch, the careful distance they maintained from the shop. Everything suggested this was something significant. As Tony watched through his window, Dutch stepped forward and raised his hand. The rumbling of engines immediately stopped, creating a silence that was somehow more intimidating than the noise had been. Nearly 200 people stood motionless, all attention focused on the elderly man who had become such an important part of Tony's week. Dutch looked directly at the shop window where Tony stood, and even from a distance Tony could see the man's expression was serious but not unfriendly. This wasn't a threat. It was something else entirely. But what? Tony realized he had two choices. He could stay inside and hope this overwhelming gathering would simply leave, or he could step outside and face whatever was about to happen. His heart pounded as he reached for the door handle, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything he thought he knew about Dutch and the simple motorcycle repair he'd completed just days earlier. The morning air felt different as Tony opened his shop door and stepped outside to meet whatever awaited him. Tony stepped out of his shop into the morning air, his heart pounding as he faced the sea of motorcycles and their riders. The silence was deafening after the thunderous rumble of engines that had filled the street moments before. Nearly 200 people stood motionless, all eyes focused on him. Dutch walked forward, moving with a confidence Tony had never seen before. Gone was the hesitant elderly man who had pushed his broken shovelhead through the shop door just over a week ago. In his place stood someone who clearly commanded deep respect among this intimidating gathering. "Tony," Dutch said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet morning air, "I want you to meet some friends of mine." The word friends seemed inadequate for what Tony was seeing. These weren't casual riding buddies or weekend motorcycle enthusiasts. The patches on their leather vests, the organized way they'd arranged themselves, the disciplined silence they maintained. Everything told Tony he was looking at something much more significant. Dutch turned to address the crowd, his voice taking on a formal tone that Tony had never heard before. "Brothers and sisters, this is Tony Williams, the mechanic I told you about. This man treated an old rider with respect and dignity when he didn't have to. He went above and beyond what anyone would expect, not because he was asked to, but because it was the right thing to do." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Tony noticed that many of the riders were nodding and several were smiling, in a way that seemed genuinely warm despite their intimidating appearance. "In our world," Dutch continued, "we judge people by their actions, not their words. We respect those who show respect, and we remember those who help our brothers when they need it most." He paused, looking directly at Tony. "This man embodies the values we hold dear: loyalty, integrity, and brotherhood." Tony felt overwhelmed by the attention and the gravity of Dutch's words. He'd simply done what seemed right, treating Dutch the way he treated any customer who came to his shop with honest intentions. Dutch reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather vest that Tony hadn't seen before. It was black leather, well made, but clearly new, with custom patches that caught the morning sunlight. The main patch on the back wasn't a club insignia but something unique, a design that incorporated motorcycle imagery with symbols Tony didn't immediately recognize. "Tony," Dutch said, stepping closer, "I'd like to present you with something that represents the respect you've earned from all of us." He held up the vest so Tony could see the patches clearly. The largest patch on the back read, "Honorary Road, Brother," in bold letters surrounded by intricate artwork that combined motorcycle elements with symbols of brotherhood and respect. The smaller patches included one that simply said "Earned," and another that showed clasped hands beneath a motorcycle wheel. "This isn't a club patch," Dutch explained. "It's something more than that. It represents respect that crosses all boundaries. Club affiliations, backgrounds, everything that usually divides people. It says that you're someone who understands what brotherhood really means. Tony stared at the vest, struggling to find words. Dutch, I just did what anyone would. Do. No, said a woman's voice from the crowd. A female rider stepped forward, her gray hair braided down her back, her vest showing patches from decades of riding. Most people wouldn't have taken the time. Most people wouldn't have cared about finding the right buyer. Most people would have seen an old man with a broken bike and nothing more. Others in the crowd began speaking up, sharing their own thoughts. Tony learned that Dutch had told them the entire story, not just about the mechanical work, but about the respect, the coffee shared over morning conversations, the care taken to find the right buyer, and the genuine friendship that had developed. You didn't just fix his bike, called out a younger rider. You helped him through one of the hardest things he's ever had to do. Dutch stepped closer to Tony, holding out the vest. This represents something that can't be bought or demanded. It has to be earned, and you've earned it through your actions. Tony accepted the vest with hands that trembled slightly. The leather was supple and well-crafted, and he could feel the weight of what it represented. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Dutch replied. Just know that you have friends here. Real friends. People who will remember what you did and who you are. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but not before many of the riders approached Tony individually. They shook his hand, introduced themselves, and several mentioned they'd heard about his work and might bring their bikes to his shop. The interactions were genuine and warm, completely different from what Tony might have expected based on appearances alone. As the motorcycles began starting up and pulling away, Dutch lingered behind. The two men stood together, watching the organized exodus of riders who had traveled from multiple states to be part of this moment. How long have you been? Tony began, then paused, unsure how to phrase his question. 43 years, Dutch answered, understanding what Tony was asking. Joined when I was young and stupid, stayed because I found something real, a brotherhood that means something, and you never mentioned it while I was working on your bike. Dutch smiled. Would it have changed how you treated me? Tony thought about it honestly. I don't think so. But I might have been more nervous. Exactly why I didn't mention it. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I was just another customer. The last of the motorcycles was pulling away when Dutch handed Tony a business card. That's my number. Real number, not some club contact. I hope you'll use it. I'd like to keep in touch if that's all right with you. Tony looked at the card. It was simple, with just Dutch's name and phone number. I'd like that too. And Tony? That vest isn't just for show. Word travels fast in the motorcycle community. People will recognize what it means and they'll treat you accordingly. You've got friends now in places you never expected. In the days that followed, Tony discovered Dutch was right. Riders he'd never met before began stopping by his shop, mentioning they'd heard about his work and his character. His business picked up significantly, but more importantly, he found himself part of a community he'd never known existed. Dutch became a regular visitor, stopping by not as a customer, but as a friend. Sometimes he brought other older riders who needed trustworthy work done on their motorcycles. Tony's shop became known as a place where everyone was welcome, regardless of their background, as long as they came with honest intentions. The experience taught Tony that respect and friendship could develop in the most unexpected ways. His simple act of treating Dutch with dignity had opened doors to a world he'd never imagined, showing him that sometimes the most meaningful connections come from treating others with basic human decency. The leather vest hung in a place of honor, in his shop, not as a trophy but as a reminder of what was possible when people chose to see past surface differences and recognize the character underneath. And whenever new customers seemed uncertain about whether they belonged in his shop, Tony would tell them what he'd learned from Dutch, that respect is earned through actions and everyone deserves a chance to show who they really are,